Okay, the session's being recorded. Great. Thank you for joining. It's really great to see you for a revision session. I know there was a collab a bit earlier, which is why we moved it later. I was hoping a few more might join, but never mind. We've also got our national support session on Wednesday night. So there's also that too, but this is a bit different, being a revision session on the actual material. So the first thing I just wanted to say is that I did send out a Google form, and there was only one response to the Google form. So I've used my initiative with this revision session based on sort of my experience. I just also wanted to say that it's quite challenging because the textbook changed this year. And as a result, there was a bit of a shift in the material. It's quite hard to find a past paper that you can work through that's not going to throw you off, because you'll suddenly worry there's stuff in there that you haven't covered. So I'm not going to use a past paper because the questions are not the same. So it doesn't give you the same sense of what we're covering, and you would probably panic. So I think you take what's in your assignments as the nature of the questions, and I'll cover some of the sort of more relevant points in this revision session where I've seen similar questions come from past papers. They're not going to be exactly the same, but they'll be similar. But I don't want you to look at past papers and then panic that there's stuff in there we haven't done, because literally we haven't done it because the textbook has changed and the curriculum has altered slightly. So don't get too stressed about past papers. We'll just have to use our initiative, I think, more than anything when we plan for this exam. So that was just my first word of caution. I've had a lot of people ask for past papers, but I don't really want to send them because it's going to throw you out, because you're not going to see what you recognize in there. So let's get started. Some of this stuff, if you attend the national support session on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, you'll see some of the stuff again in the national support session. But when I was putting the national support session together, it provides a good context for this revision session. So there is going to be a bit of duplication, but don't worry too much about it. You need to attend the national support session because of the questions other people ask and maybe a different take on things. So the first thing I did was I did take a past paper and just really looked how the questions were structured, so it can give you some guidance. So the past paper I looked at for your exam revision is basically, they're out of 120 marks. And the way this particular paper was broken down, it was broken down into 6 questions. And just to see how the marks are allocated and what the type of question was. So not going into the content specifically, but the first question was worth 20 marks. And what I want you to note here is the way each question is asking you for examples. That's why it is very important not just to understand the theory, but to be able to apply the theory. We've had a lot of questions in our assignments that have also asked for examples, but you'll see it, I've highlighted it here so you can see. So question 1, whatever the topic was about discussing it and giving examples to support it with 20 marks. The second question was discuss and provide examples to support. The third question was about describing a relationship. The fourth question was to explain something and provide a detailed example. And the fifth question was to choose any 2 of whatever the content was and discuss using clear examples. So the way those marks were broken down was 10, 20, 10, 15, 15, 10 for the first section of the paper. But the relevance here is in the examples. And that's where the key to being an excellent student happens in the marking rubric, that you can really show those examples. And so as we go through this revision session, please bear that in mind, that as much as it is the content and the theory, it's about you being able to apply it, whether it's in a scenario or a case study, or finding examples from research, or finding examples from your own life. All of it is going to be example driven. Okay, as a proportion of the marks. And the second question was the long question, an essay question, which was to write an academic essay with 50 marks. But as we've had in our assignments, it's broken down into mark components. So there's marks for an essay structure, there's marks for a definition of something, which is usually in your introduction. This particular essay was on schizophrenia, to explain the causes, to explain the diagnosis and the treatment approaches. So that is how a paper is generally structured. Sort of shorter essay style questions in the first one, and then a longer essay style question as the second one. I can't guarantee it, but the reason for doing this was to show you how that word example comes up multiple times. Okay, so please just bear that in mind as you work through the theory for this module. So remember, when we also talk about examples of things, your examples need to be sufficient for the mark allocation. So if it's 20 marks, and 10 marks could be for the theory and 10 marks could be for the mark allocation. So you need to make sure that the examples you provide are sufficient. Not just a one-liner. Generally, there is more sufficiency needed than that to show that you can actually do this. The examples need to be relevant, so they need to link to whatever the theory is. So make sure whatever example you give, it links specifically to the theory, not examples from the textbook. Okay, so the textbook is littered with examples, but you don't use the examples from the textbook. You have to use your own ability to provide examples to show that you can apply the theory. In general, the mark allocation, the guideline is really write one elaborated idea for each mark in the mark allocation. So if the mark allocation is 5 marks, make sure you've got sort of 5 well-structured sentences that are clear and each one identifying a different idea. My tongue is all over the place today. Pay close attention to the command term. So, for example, it would say explain, which means how or why. It would say compare something. So really look at that command term, and we'll see that when we look shortly at our learning outcomes. And if there are scenario questions, and we've seen a scenario question in our assignment, keep referring to the themes from the scenario and try to find as many hooks in the question and linked psychological ideas as there are marks available. So really, for every psychological idea, you need to try and find something to hook it back to the scenario. So rather than just write out all the theory and then put 1 or 2 sentences at the end, for each idea or sort of a couple of sentences that are one idea, make sure you hook it back to the scenario, so that there is sufficient referencing back to the scenario to show how you can link the scenario to the theory that you're giving. Okay, so that is just some guidelines really to keep in mind as we work through some of this revision material. What I've done with the revision material is I've taken each of the module out, or the different sections of the learning units, and we're going to look at each of the learning outcomes. And I can't cover them all, but what I'll try and do is cover some of the ones where possibly we could see some questions arising. And again, it is just a little bit luck of the draw, but it's based on sort of what I've seen in past papers and how questions are focused. So what I want you just to do for the main is, and I think it's an important part of your revision, is to take each of these learning units as they are in your module outlines and look specifically at each learning outcome and make sure you can answer what is in that learning outcome, because when the examiner sets the paper, they're not going to set things outside of those specific learning outcomes. So we'll see as we go through exactly how your assignment questions have been asked that answer those learning outcomes, even some of our ICE tasks. And what you also need to look at is, we spoke just now about the command words, and you'll see in those learning outcomes there are specific command words about what you need to be able to do. So for example, in learning outcome 1, outline the major events of the 3 stages of prenatal development. Now we had that as an ICE task, okay? And so there the key word is outline. What outline means is set out the major points. And that's sort of what we did in that ICE task. We set out the major points of each of those stages. There's another word there, identify. Identify means to name, select, and recognize. So we did that. We identified some of the influences on prenatal development. Explain means to set out purposes or reasons, make relationships between things clear, say why and how, and support with relevant evidence. Discuss means write about an issue or topic in depth and in a structured way. So each one of our learning outcomes has got a specific command task associated to it. So just be able to recognize that command task, and that is the focus of how you prepare your sort of exam revision. Is I would work with those learning outcomes and then look at the content and make sure you can link the content, and it's quite specific in its page referencing, link the content to that learning outcome, because the questions the examiner asked, sorry Lou, you haven't missed much. It's being recorded. If you want to refresh on the bit you missed, it's fine. So the content, the exam questions will link to those learning outcomes. Okay, so that's the first sort of key for doing your exam revision, is to go through each of them and make sure you can link the content that's given to that learning outcome. We have covered a lot of this content already in our assignments. So if we've covered it in our assignments, and again, it is just me speaking, they wouldn't necessarily cover it again in the exam. So you could put a tick next to the stuff we've covered in assignments, and then focus specifically in on the stuff we haven't. So in our ICE tasks, we've done the stages of prenatal development, we've done some of the influences. That learning outcome 5, illustrate how individuals learn to communicate. We wrote an essay on that in our last paper. So what here is one of the things that's left, and it is attachment in early emotional development with children. Are you good? And so the reason I also did that is there was a question in a previous paper about attachment, but it was linking attachment to parenting styles, which we haven't done in this new material, which is why I don't want to give you the paper, because you would misinterpret the question. So really we're just focusing in on attachment. So what I'm going to do is just work through these learning units, and where I feel that a question might arise, or I feel maybe there's some clarity needed, then I'll do a little bit more work on that particular topic. Okay, so in this first learning unit, which actually goes over 2 pages because it was quite a long one, the first thing we're just going to touch on is attachment, and just make sure you understand what attachment is. So attachment is, we're talking about children, and we're talking about that emotional bond they have to the primary caregiver, which is generally the mother. And attachment, the attachment a child has to their primary caregiver, actually shapes their relationships in future life. Okay, and basically the attachment is really established with the primary caregiver in the first 2 years of a child's life. And the theory of attachment that we look at Bowlby's theory of attachment, but the one that was asked in the past is Mary Ainsworth's strange situation that she used, basically to assess the quality of attachment of a child to a mother, and that's what she did. And using this sort of situation with a child and a mother being observed through a two-way glass and a stranger entering, she managed to identify 4 different types of attachment that a child can have to a primary caregiver. And the main type of attachment that about 70% of children exhibit is the most secure attachment, and it's a kind of attachment that leads a child to grow up in a sociable person who's going to go into relationships, who's going to make friends, who's going to get a job, keep a job, and it's the most secure form. All the other kinds of attachments are more anxious and can lead to negative self-image and negative self-worth. So that primary form of attachment is a secure attachment. So that is when the mother is in the room with the child, and the child plays happily, When the mom leaves, the child isn't very happy, and when the mom returns, the child welcomes her and plays with her. And that means that there's been a good relationship, a good forming of attachment between the mother and a child, and the child will grow up secure with a good self-concept and go on to succeed in life. The other kind of attachment styles are anxious attachments. Okay, so you have an insecure or anxious avoidant type of attachment, an anxious sort of ambivalent attachment, and a disorganized attachment. And each one of those leads the child to develop in a certain way, but it's got a more negative connotation than that secure attachment. So where there's a sort of anxious avoidant attachment, the child will play happily, and when the mom leaves, the child will carry on playing happily, and when the mom returns, basically ignores the mother. And about 10 to 20% of children exhibited that particular kind of attachment. The insecure or ambivalent attachment, the anxious ambivalent, is the child clings to the mother, very preoccupied with the mother. If the mom leaves, the child will probably stop playing, and when the mom returns, the child is angry and needy and clingy. And the final kind is a disorganized attachment, where the child has probably got a very poor relationship with the primary caregiver. The primary caregiver might not be the mother. It might be a creche or something, but it's where they've probably been treated badly. The child is very cautious in the room. When the mom leaves, the child will be really confused or scared, and when the mom returns, there can be sort of some aggressive behavior and basically acting oddly. So through the process of attachment, a child develops into further life, and that is fundamental, that it happens in the first 2 years of a child's life, and it can't be changed. It's a very fixed process that happens. So it's very much based on the maternal behavior that the mother has. It's about being a responsive and sensitive parent, where we can teach our children the world is predictable, whereas an unresponsive or insensitive parent causes children not to venture too far, and those children will be needy and demanding, and it can have an impact on future development. So there's a really good YouTube channel that you can subscribe to and just go onto. It's called Sprouts, and it's a great sort of animated one of those lovely animated sort of things where they draw and explain things at the same time. And if you go onto Sprouts, and you can take a note of it, and you look for attachment, there's a really fantastic sort of 7-minute video that gives you a great perspective of how important attachment is in those first 2 years of a child's life. So purely because we've had a question on attachment in the past, I have put it in, and I know it's one of the things we haven't covered in an assignment. So it might be an area just to make sure that you understand those different types of attachment. You could maybe see a scenario playing out where they give you a relationship between a mother and a child and ask you to suggest what kind of attachment it is. So there could be various ways that plays out. But I think just understand it, and you would all be good with that. But that Sprouts channel is a really good channel, and it's got a lot of different topics on there. Some of them are psychological and others are not necessarily, but their videos are really, really good to watch. Okay, so I hope that helps on attachment. In the second part of this learning outcome 1, we've done Erikson. We did Erikson in an assignment. There's Piaget. You need to be able to provide an overview, and Vygotsky to explain. And I've put an arrow there because we're going to just talk about Kohlberg, purely because Kohlberg has come up in a past paper. Okay, so the reason I picked Kohlberg is I've seen it in a past paper. Describe the stages of adolescence. Those are all quite straightforward and in your textbook. Explain the components again. And quite a nice question that is quite interesting, which could be something about Erikson, because remember we did Erikson those stages in childhood, but Erikson also applies to adulthood, and that could be a question where they might ask you to think about yourself, because we know they've seen a tendency to ask these slightly reflective questions, to say that in adulthood, whereabouts in Erikson stages are you, or to give an example or something. There could be a little bit of a reflective question in there, and that's purely just a bit of a gut feel possibly, but please don't quote me, but I'm just saying that's how we maybe need to look at some of these learning outcomes. On Kohlberg, and the reason I put Kohlberg in, as I said, is I've seen it in a past question, and the past question was to identify those different stages of Kohlberg's and to discuss what stage you are in and give reasons why you think you are in that stage. So again, it was quite a reflective question. Theory reflecting back into your own personal circumstance. So Kohlberg was based around a moral dilemma, and he was looking at moral reasoning. Okay, that was his theory was, and he presented, I think, teenagers really with moral dilemmas, and he looked at what their response was to moral dilemmas, and he was interested in not necessarily what their answer was, but the reasoning behind their answer. And he said people progress through a series of 3 levels of moral development, but each of those levels can be broken into sub-levels. And each stage represents a different way of thinking. So where people went wrong in the previous one is actually there's 3 levels, but each one is broken into 2 stages. Okay, so if they ask you about Kohlberg, do not go the 3 levels, you need to go the 6 stages, okay, which is also important because people got lost a little bit on that point. So what I've done is, again, it's on Sprouts, and I've just summarized really the example that's on Sprouts to help you understand this a little bit more. So the first stage is about a punishment orientation. This is the pre-conventional level. It happens in children. Okay, so it's very much not as adults or adolescents. It's happening earlier in our lives as children. And that pre-conventional level, there's 2 stages: punishment orientation and a reward orientation. So it's very much about self. Okay, self being punished and self being rewarded. So the example that they use in Sprouts is that there's a fight in the playground at school, and Tom is beating up another child, and there's a number of children gathered around watching, and it's looking at the responses of different children. So let's call the child Jim. So Jim observes this fight happening, and Jim does not want to get involved because he's scared of being punished. If I get involved in this fight, I'm going to be punished. It's a punishment orientation. He's basically looking at himself and the fact he can be punished. Jill is looking at the fight, okay, and now she's gone beyond punishment orientation and she's now in the reward orientation. She's very much motivated by self-interest. She thinks, if I get into this fight and I help whoever Tom was fighting, can't remember what we called him, help the other boy sort of win, if I help him now, I may be able to be helped later. Okay, so it's very much based on what can be rewarded for me, self-interest. Right and wrong is determined by what can be rewarded. The second level is the conventional level. So this is moving more towards sort of teenagers, late adolescents, and the first one is called the good boy, good girl orientation. So right and wrong is determined by close others' approval or disapproval. So Julie is standing there watching the fight, and she sees nobody else is getting in the fight. So she says, well, I'm not going to get involved either because nobody else is, and I want to be seen as conforming. I don't want to be seen as the one that stands out. Okay, so she's very much looking to be accepted, and so therefore she's not going to break the conformity, and she's going to say, I'm out of this because no one else is stepping in to sort this out. The fourth stage is the authority orientation. So this is very much now where society, so the first one was around sort of peers and social structures. The next one is about those rules and systems in society. The teacher intervenes and shouts stop because he believes he needs to uphold the rules in order for a society to function, in this case, the school. Okay, so that's his orientation. What's right and wrong? It's wrong to fight. I'm going to stop the fight. You need to stop it. It's determined by the school's rules or society's laws, which need to be obeyed. Okay, so it's very much an authority orientation. The fifth stage is starting to get to a point where, as you get older, not many people start to reach these higher stages. So the fifth stage is that it's about a social contract. Right and wrong is determined by society's rules, which are viewed as fallible rather than absolute, which means that a rule can be broken. Okay, those rules are not absolute, but in certain circumstances, I mean, the rules are not absolute. In certain circumstances, they can be broken. So Louise is standing back and she's seeing the fight and she says, well, they're fighting. Does this rule serve all the members of the school community? Maybe Tom or the little boy that's being beaten up actually deserved it. Maybe he hit somebody else. Maybe he'll go on and hit somebody else in the future. So I'm not looking at myself. I'm not looking at the rewards and the punishment, but I'm looking at, in this instance, fighting is wrong, but maybe the person who's being beaten up actually deserved it, and she'll make her choice based on that assumption or that perspective. And the very final stage that they use is the headmaster steps in, and all the kids were called to the office. And he has a moral compass or a moral principle, and his moral principle is compassion. And we all need to be compassionate regardless of what the situation is. He's very much looking at the underlying ethical principles. So it's a much deeper and it's a much deeper kind of moral thinking. It's not about society. It's not about ourselves. It's about the ethical principles that underpin it. So honesty, for example, you believe that honesty is such a core value that regardless what is happening, as long as somebody is honest, that is the right way to go about making a judgment call. So it's a nice way to explain to you how those different stages work. Using a good example, and you would need to think about it and say, well, in my life, which stage am I in? I was listening on the radio actually while I was preparing the slide, and there was a story on the radio about how a man recently had found a check made out to the Haribo Sweet Company for like $34 million or something, and he sent the check back to them. And he said, I think he emailed them, and they said to him, if you tear up the check and show us evidence that you've torn up the check, we would be very grateful. So the man said, okay, well, that's cool. He did it, and he got sent 4 packets of Haribo sweets. And it really I thought a lot how that actual incident, we could work through those different stages. So somebody might pick up the check, somebody else, and go, I can't keep this because I know I'm going to be found out and I know I'm going to be punished. That would be somebody in the punishment orientation. Someone else might pick up the check and go, oh, I found this check. Maybe if I send the check back to them, they're going to give me a good cut of the check. Okay. The person in the third stage might say, oh, my friends, what would they do? And I don't want to be being seen as different to my friends, so I'm going to ask their advice and do whatever they do. So you can see how that example could be applied through these different stages. And the 6th stage is about honesty, and it's about saying my core value is honesty, and regardless of what the punishment or the reward, honesty is the most important principle that I have. So that's the moral reasoning, guys, and I hope that makes it clear for you. The chapter on personality, the next learning unit. So again, we've covered a lot, those learning outcomes 1 and 2. We've done the 5-factor model and we've looked at our own personality. So I don't think necessarily there'll be a question from there. So the second theme is those different theories of personality. So there's the 4 different types, the psychodynamic, behavioral, humanistic, and biological, and each one is discussed. So what I've done, and it's similar to what I put in our collabs, is I've taken this table from the textbook, which I think is a good way to get a good outline of these 4 different theories of personalities. I've sort of just typed it up in my own table. And what you can do is do a similar thing, but just make sure you can elaborate on it. So I've compared and been able to discuss the 4 different approaches. So the psychodynamic approach was from Freud. How did he get his data? He got it from case studies of psychoanalysis. What are his key assumptions? Childhood events were important, and the role of the unconscious. His model was about the id, ego, and superego. The view of personality development, psychosexual experiences in early childhood, leaving a lasting mark, and the roots of the disorder was unconscious fixations, conflict, sex, and aggression. So it's a very useful table, and if I was you, I would also type up a similar or write up a similar type of table. Make sure you can elaborate. This is really just a summary, but it gives a nice way to put those 4 different personality theories alongside each other, because we do know they also like tables to explain and discuss things. So they could say, discuss two different approaches to personality development, and then pretty much you've got your table set up where you've got the basis for that ability to be able to discuss two different ones. Okay, so that's quite straightforward. It is just from the textbook. So just make sure you're clear on those 4 different personality approaches. Okay, and this will be in the slides, and it will be in the, you'll see it in the recording. So it's just my approach as to how I would actually get to be able to get to grips with this particular section of the material, if that makes sense. Okay, I don't know if there's any questions on that, but I don't think we'll be having the personality traits again. So where else would they ask a question from? It's going to be from one of these theorists and one of these approaches to personality development. So that's the table I pretty much summarized just in note form, and then I would use it just to build on and elaborate. The stress coping and health, I haven't done a revision session on this because we've had questions in the assignment and it's not terribly difficult. Okay, it's one of the easiest sections. We've had questions about how do you deal with things. So I would know this content and know how to apply it to our personal lives. We've had some questions on stress. We've had a question on describing what a healthy lifestyle means. So I think just look at those items where we haven't looked. Some of the stresses experienced in South Africa could be quite interesting. We've done how we respond to stress. The effect of stress could be a question. And we've also looked at how we can how we've had that question where we've had to reflect on how we deal with our own stresses. So we've covered a fair bit in that chapter in assignments, but maybe pick out some of the key points that we haven't covered and be able to apply it, because stress can also be quite personal, as we have discussed in our assignments. Okay, learning unit 4, abnormal behavior. So we've already had, so we had to discuss defining what abnormal behavior is and the purpose of the DSM-5. That's all very straightforward, and that is in your collabs that we've done, and the criteria and what they use to make a diagnosis. The second theme of anxiety disorders, we've had an assignment on anxiety disorders. So my gut feel is that they wouldn't cover it again. So I would focus and be particularly aware of the depressive and bipolar related disorders, as well as the schizophrenia disorders. So when we look at the learning outcomes here, and let's look first at the depressive and bipolar related disorders. The first learning outcome is to differentiate. So differentiate means to be able to show the difference between. So this could be quite a nice table kind of question, or something that they ask what is the difference between unipolar and bipolar. So we did look at it. We looked at it in our collab. It's about a mood continuum, where a unipolar is just one side of the continuum, it's depression, whereas bipolar is a switch between the depression and the mania. Okay, so there's two different elements to bipolar, whereas unipolar is one. So there are different DSM-5 characteristics for both, and the little image I've put up here is an ability to sort of differentiate between them. So with bipolar depression, that's where people have both moods. They sleep less, wake up feeling energetic even though they have less sleep, restlessness and difficulty focusing or working on multiple projects at one time, a high mood that's extreme contrast to the depressed mood, that's the bipolar component, speaking faster than usual, increased agitation or irritability. Whereas the unipolar, which is the depression side, when somebody only has depression, has changes in sleeping patterns, withdrawal from social activities, constantly feeling hopeless, worthless, fatigue and lack of energy, frequently having thoughts of suicide or death. And if they ask you to compare, please do not use this table. Do your research. And I haven't put it on here, but it's on our NSS for Wednesday, is just check on the bottom of your exam, because the last exam it said that questions that show use of additional research, although we know some questions ask for it in the question, it says answers that use additional research will be scored higher. So again, where it's got this differentiate between unipolar and bipolar, do your research, use your DSM-5, but there are significant differences to be able to understand the difference between unipolar and bipolar. Okay. The next part was describe the major depressive disorder in terms of its nature and prevalence. So 2 pieces to this part: understanding the nature of it. So what is major depressive disorder? So remember, it's not talking about bipolar now. So the only place we've got bipolar is in that differentiate between unipolar and bipolar. Those other learning outcomes focus on the the third one does, the 14 does, but specifically be able to look at the major depressive disorder, know what the nature of it is. So in that instance, what is it? So we've got our DSM-5 characteristics. There's a summary at the top. The nature is it's the persistent feelings of sadness and despair. As per the definition, the DSM-5, elaborate with examples. Sufferers can exhibit symptoms of other disorders. It can occur at any point in the lifespan, more than one episode over the course of the life, and the earlier onset, there's more reoccurrences. So that's from your textbook, and it's telling you what the nature of it is. So prevalence is something different. Prevalence means the proportion of the population who have had a specific characteristic of it in a given time period. And there's a section in your textbook specifically saying prevalence. So the prevalence is, in this instance, is it's common. Okay, that means it's a high proportion of the population who have it. It happens twice as much in women as in men. And why? It gives some reasons as to why that prevalence happens. The twice as high in women. Women have an elevated vulnerability during their life cycle. So they have postpartum depression and postmenopausal depression, and that can lead to this continuous major depressive disorder. Women are also more likely to be victims and suffer from stress and adversity. So things like sexual assault, poverty, harassment, societal pressure. So women are more likely to be victims of that. And women also dwell more on difficulties and challenges. So that would explain why the prevalence is higher in women than men. So just make sure you can understand to be able to discuss the nature of something and if the prevalence is something different. Okay, so it might ask you to discuss the nature and discuss the prevalence, or one of them or both of them, but just understand the difference there. Okay, nature is very much about the disease or the mental illness and what it is, and the prevalence is who gets it, who does it occur with, and why, and how many, that kind of question. It asks you to explain the etiology, and again in your textbook, it's broken down into 6 different causes. Remember, causes is the etiology, and it says depressive and bipolar, and they're 1 in your textbook. So there's 6 different reasons why depression, major depressive disorder, and bipolar can occur. There's a genetic vulnerability. It could be to do with the neurotransmitters and a structure in the brain. It could be to do with hormones, cognitions, our faulty thinking. It could be to do with our interpersonal roots, our social well-being, and it could be from the precipitation of stress. So make sure for each of those you're clear. Often this is the kind of place where extra research is needed, or they ask you to do extra research, so you're not just quoting from the textbook or citing what's exactly in the textbook, but part of an essay question could be write an essay on bipolar, discuss the nature, discuss the prevalence, and discuss the etiology, and use additional research to substantiate your answer. All right, so you are going to have to go beyond the textbook in questions like this. And the 4th theme that we haven't been examined on or in our assignment is schizophrenia. So a previous paper had schizophrenia in it, and that's sort of where I got that question at the beginning. And the reason I didn't put the question itself in is because in the previous material, we spent a lot of time looking at the treatment options, whereas in this material, we haven't really looked at all at the specific treatment. So I haven't put the question in because I don't want to throw you out. Okay, by making you going, well, we haven't learned about treating schizophrenia, so I've left it as per the learning unit. So what it wants you to do is be able to explain schizophrenia spectrum-related disorders. First thing. So schizophrenia spectrum-related disorders is a class of disorders. So remember, we're talking about a spectrum. So it used to be that there were 4 or 5 different kinds of schizophrenia. There's paranoid schizophrenia and different ones like that. What they've done is they've taken those 4 or 5 different types of schizophrenia and put them under one umbrella called schizophrenia spectrum-related disorders. So it's a class of disorders marked by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and deterioration of adaptive behavior. At the center of schizophrenia is thought. Okay, it's about thinking. The spectrum of disorders is a group of related disorders that share some symptoms. So previously there were subtypes which are now grouped together as a spectrum. So you need to understand what schizophrenia spectrum-related disorders are, and it's in your book, and some additional research would give you more information on that. It then asks you to describe the symptoms associated with schizophrenia. So that's all it's asking for in this instance. Okay, your learning outcomes are to explain the schizophrenia spectrum disorders and be able to describe the symptoms. So again, we say it was the class of disorders, but it's marked by, and if we look at our DSM-5 for schizophrenia, you can see in the DSM-5 hallucinations. So these are the symptoms: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms. It lays them out a little bit differently in your textbook, but to me, when we are saying what are the symptoms, I would always tend to go with what's in the DSM-5 because it's very clearly laid out and you can cite it very easily. So delusions is about false, unrealistic beliefs. It's often a paranoia, control. It's about feeling better than others. Your thinking becomes chaotic rather than logical and linear. So it's very much delusional. Hallucinations is about perceptual disorders, which are mostly auditory, and there's no auditory stimulus. They're actually hearing things inside their head. Mainly they're auditory hallucinations. Disorganized speech, meaning jumbled, all over the place, jumping from one topic to the next, making bizarre trains of thought and random connections. Movement is often impaired. You become completely inactive to the point where you have catatonia, which is you basically frozen in an unusual body posture. And negative symptoms are, it's basically there's no emotional expression, there's a lack of goal-orientated behavior, there's social withdrawal and apathy. So as it says there, the symptoms are there, but in order to be diagnosed, symptoms must be present for at least 1 month, and they need to have at least either hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized speech as one of those symptoms. So that's all the learning unit outcome asks us to do. It says to be able to know and discuss and understand the symptoms of schizophrenia. Okay, so that is our schizophrenia. I'm not touching on the treatment because we had a question on these different types of treatments in our assignment. So I'm not too sure how they might ask a section from this. It might ask you, I'm not sure what it might ask you, but there's not much in your material, and hence why in the assignment you had to do extra research for this question. So I would just refresh those different treatments and yeah, look at the other stuff, but I'm not entirely sure about this, and I will leave that to you just to revise and refresh and just be comfortable with. And the final section, and so is our learning unit 6, which is intelligence. Now we know we haven't had this in an assignment, so for sure there's going to be questions out of this learning unit. And I don't know if you have watched the session or the collab, but the reason I just put these arrows in here so we can see it's got distinguish between. So again, that's going to be the difference between. There's a nice learning outcome 3 is to differentiate between. So when they do that, you can see a table maybe coming up with single factor, multiple factor. differentiate between, again, it could be a table, and we do know that occasionally they like tables to ask us to compare. And the others are quite straightforward. And the reason I just picked these ones out is because it just looks for the ability to differentiate. And I've seen a question in a past paper about differentiating between fluid and crystallized intelligence. So all I've done for this is I've just taken it out of what we've actually just done in the last learning unit, just to refresh our memories. So I would also always assume that they would look for us to define intelligence and compare it to what IQ is. So intelligence is the broad ability of our complex mental skills, all of them, all of our mental activities, all of our mental processes, in order to be able to do tasks, to solve problems, to think about abstract things and information. So it's very much mental processes. It's all of them, all of our mental being when it comes to thinking about things, knowing things, perceiving things. Whereas IQ is a measure, okay? It's a numerical representation of our level of intelligence as measured as a measured, standardized, and scientific tool or instrument. So it's our intelligence test. It's bringing everything in your intelligence down to, well, it's not even everything in our intelligence. It's actually usually focused on those things that we study or learn. It's generally those things linked to academic success, mainly abstract reasoning and verbal fluency. So to be able to really differentiate between the two, it could be quite a simple 10-mark question to explain the difference between intelligence and intelligence testing. The way intelligence is understood, described, and measured, like any scientific concept based on a theoretical context that reflects cultural, social, historical, and economic framework of society at any given time. And there's different kinds of intelligence. This is why it's very hard to measure intelligence and how we look at the single factor or G, because there are different kinds. And IQ testing focuses a lot on what is needed in an academic situation, but there are multiple other intelligences as well that need to be considered when we're looking at what our intelligence is. So just make sure you understand the difference between those. Another question is to differentiate. So we like differentiation questions between single factor and multiple factor views of intelligence. So your single factor view is really the factor that is the predominant factor. That intelligence is a singular construct. It's not multiple things, and it was developed by Charles Spearman, who developed a statistical procedure called factor analysis. And basically, he looked at a whole lot of traits around intelligence, and he clustered them all together. And he actually came up with a fact that across all of those different intelligences, like mechanical, spatial, numerical, verbal, those are called S intelligences, there's a level of commonality between all of them. And so what he did was he took that commonality between all of them and he called it G. And G is that single factor that can measure intelligence because it's common across all of those S intelligences. So if you want to see how intelligent somebody is, you start with the G factor, which is measured by a sort of a test for general mental ability, but then you add to it a test for the specific ability, which could be mechanical, but your G always remains constant throughout whatever you're testing for. So it's a general mental ability, and all of our better known tests are based upon this concept that between all of these other kinds of abilities, there's a commonality between all of them, where they all come together, and that is your general mental ability called G, which is a single factor view. So later on, someone came along, Louis Thurston, and he said, well, you actually can't. He went back to basics again, and he said, you can't narrow this down to a single factor. There have to be multiple factors of intelligence. And he came up with 7 measures of primary mental ability: word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numerical ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. But regardless of that, factor analysis continued to prove that even those independent variables were correlated together. So it went back to the fact that there actually is a single factor G that is a general mental ability, and that maintains today in all of the psychological testing that is done is generally Spearman's single factor theory is an underlying component of psychological tests. So yeah, I mean, it is just a case of being able to differentiate between single factor and multiple factor, and be able to do that. Okay, so that's just why I picked that particular one out. Again, another one, differentiate, is what our learning outcome is. So what is the difference between similarities and differences, fluid and crystallized intelligence? So following on from what Spearman did, Cattell in the 1980s says, well, G actually is G, but G can be divided into two parts, one of which is fluid intelligence, and that is reasoning ability, memory capacity, speed at which we can process information. And the second part is crystallized intelligence, which involves the ability to apply knowledge and skills to problem solving. So there's a table there that I've put where there's a difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence basically it's something that we're born with. It's an inherited ability to reason and think. If you look at it, that the crystallized and fluid is sort of what you're born with, which evolves, but crystallized is what grows as we grow and we experience life, and as we experience knowledge. Our crystallized intelligence grows exponentially across our lifespan, whereas our fluid intelligence, we're born with it and then it sort of reaches its peak and tapers off. So with that in mind, we say a fluid intelligence is an inherited ability to reason and think. It's very much got a neurophysiological base, so it's dependent on the actual brain and the state of our brain and our nervous system. It's got minimal dependence on school and learning acculturation. So no matter what happens in school and what we learn and how much is given to us, we still remain with that fluid intelligence. It's pretty much around inductive reasoning, sort of unconscious reasonings, logical reasoning. It's something that we solve problems sort of inherently, and it's to do very much with nature. How are we born? We're born with a fluid intelligence, whereas our crystallized intelligence grows. It's about accumulated knowledge and information over our lifespan. And you can see the blue line on the graph. Our crystallized intelligence grows as we get older, whereas the fluid intelligence tapers off. It's being able to application of skills and knowledge to problem solving. So as we learn skills and gain knowledge, our ability to solve problems gets better, and we apply what we learn to solving problems. It's very much dependent on education. That our crystallized intelligence gets stronger. It's around verbal and general knowledge, so you can see that links to what we're finding out and what we know, and so it's very much nurture based. Okay, so I put that in there purely because I've seen it in a past paper. It was in one of our supplementary exams, and it was to differentiate between fluid and crystallized intelligence. That's why I popped it in there. Yeah, and that's the learning outcomes. So my suggestion to you is you do exactly what I've done, is go through those learning outcomes, make sure you understand them all clearly. I've just put in the last two slides because I did have someone again ask me the other day about the difference between academic and journal articles, and please pay very specific attention. And guys, if you are struggling with this still, just make an appointment with the online librarian before it is too late. If you don't know how to use EBSCOhost, if you're still trying to do it just off the internet with websites, please make sure you know how to. We're in a limited time frame, so you'll need to know how to get into EBSCOhost, how to do a decent search, how to pick up a good journal article. And so those sort of technicalities around the internal working of the VC library, please, I just urge you, before it's too late, try and get an appointment with the online librarian. It's really important. So your article is a piece of prose often included in different publications such as newspaper and magazines. So not an article. If it asks for a journal is a scholarly publication. And I went through this in my last NSS, consisting of academic study, achievements, and information concerning a particular discipline. So make sure you know the differences. Are academic articles and journals and articles the same? A journal or a scholarly journal is a scholarly means it's about from learned people, aimed at learned people, about learned things, aimed at specialists and researchers. So that's what we're looking for, generally written by experts in the field and generally got technical language in, often with original research, conclusions based on data, etc., etc. So please make sure that you know how to do that. And I say wherever possible, include additional research. You do have time. It does, even if the question doesn't ask for it, you know, you put it in, because otherwise you're just going to be paraphrasing textbooks and things. So where possible, include additional research, but specifically academic journal articles. Make sure you know you've got a limited time to access that database, that you know how to go in quickly, cleanly, and be able to search what you're looking for. Okay, so that you don't waste too much time on that. And I was very impressed by your essays and things that you're writing, and you're getting a good grip on the introduction and conclusion. So I won't spend too much time on this. Introductions generally are quite generous. Try to devote 10% of the word count to your introduction, because it's often where you'll put in your definitions about what you're defining, what your essay is going to be on. So if my essay is on major depressive disorder, you could put some kind of introduction to major depressive or disorder in there. So you identify the subject by key terms, and make sure you define the key terms. Highlight the major issues which lie behind the question. Let your reader know what you'll be identifying as your main themes, and signpost the main arguments. Okay, introductions are very important, as first impressions count, and it's very true, guys. First impressions count, create a halo effect in the mind of the lecturer. So if you see a really good introduction, you've already got your halo on, and we will look at the rest of the essay in a good light. Okay, so start it off well, you could be forgiven for an error later on. So pay attention to an introduction and make sure that it's worthy. 10% of your mark. Don't get caught up in the essay, but just clear identifiers of what your topic is with some definition, etc., and introduce your content. And the conclusion, again, give it the credit that it deserves. 10% of your essay words in your conclusion. So 10% for the introduction, 10% for the conclusion, 80% for the body. Ideally, the conclusion should summarize the key themes. Don't bring home new stuff. State the take-home message, weigh up the evidence presented, and make a decision if there's as to what you are supporting and why. You could suggest further research, but that doesn't matter. Don't include new information. If you're unsure of what to write, read the essay question and answer it in one paragraph. That's a good way to look at a conclusion. All right. And points that unite or embrace several themes can be used to great effect. So yeah, that's just to sort of tie it together there with the essay question. And that is the last slide. So I hope that helped. There's a lot to cover. As I said to you, can't cover it all in one revision session. Nobody asked for anything specific, so I've just gone with my guts. I'm going to turn off the recording, but if